This is our discussion on organic agriculture for the agroecology class. The way I'd like for us to start looking at organic agriculture is for you to look online. This was actually an assignment to look online at the National Organic Program website. This is a program of the USDA, to look at the regulations and also read these crop standards. And I also mentioned the national list. So if you click on the Organic Program website, it takes you to the National Organic Program, and these standards are written in the form of regulations. If you read basically these 5 standards, these were the key ones that I want you to start learning about. These have to do with crops. And that's one point about our program. The NOP is what we often call the National Organic Program, is that it's broken down into crop, livestock, this is livestock here, and then handling or processing standards. And the standards might actually be a little hard to understand. So, you click on them, but you can have a look at land requirements. This is one of the first ones to look at for crop production, organic crop production. And you can see the standard says that no prohibited substances can be used for a period of 3 years before production and harvesting of the crop. So that's an example of what the standards look like. Here's the one on soil fertility and crop management. And as you look at these, you can probably see it's not the most user-friendly. And there's a reason for that, the way the standards are written. It's written by lawyers, so the organic program, the standards can be enforced. So that's why it's written this way, in the form of regulations. If you look at the one here on soil fertility, you see that the producer must manage crop nutrients and soil fertility through rotations and cover crops and the application of plant and animal materials. What that is soil amendments for compost. And there's a very distinct definition too for what compost is, and you can read about that here. So it's important to understand how these regulations are put together, and then be able to refer to them if you have questions about what counts as an organic practice or not. You don't have to depend on somebody else to tell you. I want you to learn how to go directly to the source. So I'm going to back out of this now, but that's why I have y'all look at the National Organic Program website itself and read the crop standards, and then also read the national list, which is further down on this website that we were looking at. The national list is actually a list of materials, substances that can be used in organic production. Basically, almost all natural materials can be used, but synthetic ones cannot. So we'll talk more about these regulations. I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint, because this is the way that I'd like for us to start exploring organic agriculture. It's important to think about what you already know about organic ag. It actually has to do with many soil building practices that we've talked about, and with livestock it has to do with cage-free organic feed and also access to the outdoors. The National Organic Program of the USDA Department of Ag, it is a certification program, and as I mentioned, in general, synthetic materials are not permitted and natural materials are. But it's not just a chemical-free program. Sometimes that's how we think of organic, as, well, you don't use pesticides in organic production. You probably know that. But there's much more to the program, And actually in many languages it's called ecological agriculture. In English we happen to use the term organic ag, but it is biological ag. That's another word some languages use for it. This is practiced all over the world, organic agriculture. But it's not just chemical free. It's actually one of the definitions, the main definition is that it is a system. It's a production system that is site specific. There's not a recipe for it. It really depends on the site, that uses biological, cultural, mechanical methods. These are some of the ecological methods we talk about. Instead of chemicals, it uses cultural, biological, and mechanical to cycle nutrients, cycle other resources, and promote biodiversity. So that's basically our definition of organic ag. As I've mentioned, the standards for our program in the United States and many other countries around the world is divided into crops, livestock, and processing. And we're mainly going to talk about crops today. In the livestock class, that's where we talk more about the livestock organic standards. But we'll talk a little bit about, we'll talk about crops and then a little bit about handling or processing. We'll also discuss some of the materials that are permitted in organic production, and that's what the national list is. This is the website to make sure you know where to go to refer and learn about the organic program. The history in the U.S. is not particularly long. You know, many countries have had organic programs for a long time. Europe, the European Union, for example, has had organic regulations for about 30 or 40 years. We've only had them for about 17 years. They were finally passed in 2002, and it's called the Final Rule. It actually just took so long to get it because it was authorized. Organic legislation was authorized in the 1990 Farm Bill, but it took about 12 years of rulemaking and gathering public comment to be able to have a final rule. And one of the key things about the final rule that the public really emphasized is that no GMOs, no genetically modified organisms in the organic program, no sewage sludge used as fertilizer, and no irradiation of food products. So we got our program about 12 years ago, and one thing is that the government did become involved. I'm going to back up here a minute, because there were independent programs all over the country before we got our 2002 rule, but they all varied. And once the government got involved, a lot of people didn't like to see the government involved in this. They worried more about big business and greenwashing. But once the government got involved, that's when the crop standards and production really has grown in the U.S. Organic production is a very fast growing part of our food system. Although it's still quite small, it's only about 3% of all the food that we produce, but it is growing. The land requirements, and we took a quick look in the standards for crops, the land requirements specify that no prohibited substances can be used for 3 years before you plant and harvest your product. So that means if I were to go out in our SD garden and spray Roundup, we could not be certified organic for 3 years, is what it means. So you don't just put out do not spray signs. You also need to have physical barriers protecting your organic crops, protecting them from adjoining non-organic crop fields or places that people spray. And that's to prevent contamination or pesticide drift. So you do need to have distinct, defined boundaries and buffer zones. And in this image we can see, you know, trees can provide a buffer zone, a line of trees, grassy strips, or diversion runoff. There's a number of ways to provide distinct boundaries. Soil fertility is another standard that we took a quick look at online. And to summarize what it says is that you do need to maintain or improve the soil organic matter over time. So and the soil nutrients. So you do need to test your soil. That's required. You can't just say, assume that you have the right amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and organic matter. You need to test it and show how it's changed over time. But because you're required to build the soil, build its fertility and organic matter, it means that you do have to use cover crops, organic mulches, and conservation tillage, the soil building practices that we've talked about. You can only use natural fertilizers, so if you need to add more NPK, you need to use things like blood meal, bone meal, alfalfa meal. These are natural fertilizers. Or rock. You can use mined rock. But you can't use anhydrous ammonia, you can't use triple phosphate, some of the synthetic fertilizers, you can't use them. You can definitely use animal manure, and if it's raw, there is what's called a 120-day rule for food safety. Because if you went out in our garden and applied fresh horse manure or any type of cattle dung, any raw manure, keep in mind that there are pathogens like E. coli that can be transferred to the food. And if the food's going to be eaten within 120 days, it's something that could actually make people sick. So you do need to wait 120 days or just not apply animal manure raw. Instead, you compost it because you can destroy the pathogens by the heat of compost. I think it's interesting to point out that the manure does not actually have to come from an organic operation. It can come from a conventional operation such as Tyson Foods in Wilkesboro. You can use their poultry litter and spread it on your crops. But interestingly, in some other programs across the world, it does have to be from an organic operation. It can't be from a factory farm. There are very specific requirements for compost when you use it in organic production. And it's for these food safety reasons that you have to build your compost as a hot compost. And that does mean 25 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So you have to be able to show that you're using materials correctly. You have to keep a log of your temperatures. You can see this type of compost in the image is hot. There's a lot of steam because the compost gets up to 131, and it has to remain that temperature. It has to be at that temperature a total of 15 days. And if it's a windrow or a pile like this, it has to be aerated, so it has to be turned, and it has to be turned at least 5 times. There are other ways to make compost that send air into the compost pile to aerate it, in vessel composting, but most people in organic production are using windrows that they turn with a bucket on a tractor, and there's very specific requirements. Another important standard is the crop rotation standard, and that basically means that you really shouldn't be seeing a monoculture of a crop, like a monoculture of corn. I mean, it may look like it's a big cornfield, organic corn, but they are required to improve soil organic matter and use cover crops. So a crop rotation is required. You might see mainly corn, but what you can't see is that they have to follow that with legumes, for example. It might be a soybean. It might be a soybean crop, or it might be a cover crop. And you have to do that because you need to manage the pest in your crops, and you also need to manage either too much or too little plant nutrients. And cover crops can act as catch crops and actually remove when there's too much nutrients. So we do have good standards in terms of soil building practices with crop production, but I would say it still doesn't go far enough. because fossil fuel is still allowed. You can still, fuel your machinery with fossil fuel. It still doesn't get us closer towards the carbon neutrality that we need. Plus, intensive irrigation, that can also be used. So personally, I'd like to see us go further with organic crops. Another important standard to keep in mind is that seeds must be organic and planting stock must be organic also. So if you've been planting in the SD garden, you have to question, did the seeds that you used, were the seeds that you used, were they organic? And if you don't know, then you can't call the crop organic, because you have to be sure. You have to look at the seed packet and be sure that it's certified organic. Actually, a lot of the spinach seeds that we planted in the garden this fall, they are organic because we did seed saving and we raised them ourselves using organic practices. But organic seeds must be used, and they certainly can't be genetically modified. And they can't be treated with prohibited materials. Over time, we haven't had all the seeds in organic form have not been available, and so that's been an important part of the USDA National Organic Program, is that if you couldn't find organic seed, as long as you were able to document that you tried at least 3 different seed companies, you would be allowed to use conventional seed. But again, it could not be genetically modified, and it could not be treated with materials like fungicides to protect the seed from mold. Annual seedlings must also be organic, and I did hand y'all some of the seedlings that I started for the SD garden for your plots. I started them at home, and I actually did raise them organically because I use an organic potting mix. But you have to be sure that your organic seedlings, if that's how you start your plants, they must be organic, certified organic. And if you're using perennial planting stock like fruit trees, they must be organic or handled under organic management for at least 1 year. Another important standard to be aware of is the pest, weed, and disease control standard. And what that means is you can't use synthetic pesticides to get rid of insects or pests in your crops. You have to use the cultural, biological, and mechanical methods that we've started discussing, like intercrop or like pest predators. The praying mantis is a beneficial. It's a good insect because it eats a lot of the pests. We need more of these to eat the harlequin bugs that are in the SD garden. So you need to provide habitat for beneficials, and that means sometimes a non-crop plant, like plants that have very small flowers. The cover crop buckwheat actually is a very good plant to give harbor to our beneficials. And you might be using lures, traps, or repellents to reduce your pest. For weed control, what you saw at the SD farm, you saw mulching with plastic, and that is permitted if it's removed from the field. This is the type of machine that can lay plastic, and then you can put holes in it to plant your crops in. You have to take it out of the field every year. Ideally, you reuse it instead of sending it to the landfill. But what's even better in the future is that we want to use plastic that's biodegradable. So plastic that's biodegradable is available now. It is made of cornstarch, but it can't be used yet in organic production because it's made with genetically modified organisms. So that's why it's not actually used at the SD farm right now, the type that biodegrades. So that plastic has to be removed from the field at the end of the season. You don't have to use plastic. There's other ways to control weeds. We talked about mulching as an example, mechanical methods, hoeing, or you can use a farm implement. Flaming, you can use propane to flame and superheat the weeds. Grazing animals is another way to handle weeds. And managing your fields and beds so there are no weed seeds, and that does mean pulling weeds before they flower and have seed. And you also need to use non-synthetic controls for disease, such as soil solarization is an example. The livestock standards, again, we don't really discuss them very much in this class, but they include where the stock come from, that they should be from organic stock. The living conditions include pasture. For ruminants, for example, dairies, you want to see a grass-fed dairy is what you want to see, that most of their nutrients are coming from pasture. With pigs and poultry that need more concentrated sources of feed, they have to have outdoor access, but ruminants are required to have pasture. So organic feed is an important point of the livestock standards and health management. You can't actually use antibiotics for livestock in the livestock standards. The processing standards, they cover handling of materials, of food. And you're probably aware if you eat food that's highly processed, it's likely not to be as healthy for you. And that's really what organic is all about, is that the closer the food is to its natural state or even its raw state, generally the more healthy it's going to be for you. But you do have to, for example, wash produce. You know, this is food safety concern, and you should definitely clean and disinfect your facilities using organic materials. So you can't use quaternary ammonia to clean, you know, this is a stainless steel commercial kitchen. You have to use materials more like acetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, especially on your food contact surfaces. So what we use at the SD farm and in the garden is Sanidate for cleaning our produce. It's acetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. The national list is another important regulation, important standard in the National Organic Standards. And this is going to specify what materials you can use. And again, I've mentioned that you can generally use anything that's natural, but you can't use synthetics. The national list does allow a few synthetics. So you can look at the list and see that, for example, copper fungicides are used. It's really hard to control blight in tomatoes, for example, east of the Mississippi, you know, with humidity. So one thing that you can do is use a copper fungicide material, but you can't use a lot of it. And it's generally restricted how you use it. So there are some synthetics that are allowed. There's also a few natural materials that are not allowed in crop production because they're too toxic. And an example is arsenic, strychnine. These are natural, but they're too toxic to use. You can't use tobacco dust. It's a pretty good pesticide, but it's just too toxic. So there's a number of things that are natural, but they're listed in the national list that they're prohibited. The same thing with livestock. It does list the synthetic materials. For example, it's extremely hard to control internal parasites in livestock. So some amount of parasiticides are allowed just for breeding stock, not for the growing animals that are eaten, slaughtered and eaten. The national list also lists natural materials that are not allowed in organic livestock production, including strychnine. It's a very short list. I think that's actually the only thing on the list is strychnine. Processing will list some of the non-agricultural and therefore non-organic substances that are allowed in food processing. So that means a seaweed is an example. Carrageenan is a seaweed that's allowed, so that's listed. And also are listed the non-organically produced agricultural products that you can use for food processing. So there's some things like beet juice that are used to color food products, used as a dye, and it doesn't have to be organic beets. So one thing about processing is, surprisingly, it's possible to produce organic corn chips, organic Fritos, but I think we all know that ideally you don't process your food, and especially organic food. But that's basically a critique of the organic program, is that it still does allow a lot of food processing if that's what people want. Another critique to keep in mind is that livestock, our standards are really probably not as good as they need to be with livestock production. That factory farming, large-scale animal agriculture is still permitted. With organic chicken production, there have to be pop holes for the birds to go in and out of the building, but they don't actually have to be open all the time. They can be closed in cold weather. So sometimes the livestock is not exactly what people might expect when they buy meat products and dairy. But our crop standards are actually very good. So you need to follow the rules in organic production. You devise your own organic plan. You write a narrative about how you plan to follow organic production in line with the standards. And then you keep your records. There's quite a bit of record keeping that's required, and it's probably one of the reasons that we're not certified organic at the SD farm or our garden, is that we just have so many people that work in the garden or work at the farm. I do think it's something we should look at in the future, because that can be organized, the work that people do, and there are a number of university farms that are certified organic, so we should consider it in the future. It's important to think about exemptions to the federal guidelines, the National Organic Guidelines, that if you're a small producer, if you sell less than $5,000 per year in organic product, then you're exempt from inspection. Everybody else needs to be inspected. That means that an auditor actually comes to your farm at least once a year and inspects your operation, checks all your records, and it's an audit. So organic standards are strongly enforced. If you're small, you don't have to be inspected, but you still must follow the standards. So we can't say that our produce from the SD garden is organic unless you know for sure that the seeds that you use, potting mix, that everything is within the organic standards. So you have to know the standards if you want to call yourself organic, and you have to follow the standards, and you have to actually write out your narrative, your organic system plan about how you produce your crops. So if you misrepresent yourself as organic when you're not actually following the standards, there is an $11,000 fine. So the organic program does have strict standards, and it also has teeth for enforcement. Retailers do not need to be certified. EarthFare, for example, doesn't have to be certified, but many retailers do choose to get certified. So these are some resources for you to know about organic certification. That it's actually, I would say, a very interesting job that you might consider at some point, is being trained as an organic inspector and doing annual inspections. It's actually a job you can contract yourself out for, and I think it's a great way to travel and see different operations, and you can get trained in organic inspection. It does cost about $1,000 to get trained in crops and another $1,000 to get trained in livestock, but you can actually work for some of the accredited certifying agencies. So there's, I think the closest one to us is probably Clemson, is an accredited organic certifier. So look at this website to see the regulations and the national list and other accredited certifying agencies, and keep in mind that an annual inspection is required. So this concludes our discussion of organic agriculture.